Hello, everybody, and welcome to this SSN, Science and Society Network seminar. My name is Timothy Neale. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at Deakin University at the Alfred Deakin Institute, and also a Senior Lecturer in Anthropology at in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, emerging, and that sovereignty was never ceded. As uninvited guest on that country, I'm very grateful for their hospitality. Today, we have a presentation that is also about country. It's about land and many other things. And we're very grateful to be joined by Associate Professor Gisa Weszkalnys. I think I've got the pronunciation okay. Right. Gisa, I'll just give a brief introduction before your presentation. Gisa will be speaking to us today about kind of propositional politics against a background of global climate emergency and energy transition. And for those of you who are joining the seminar via YouTube, please know throughout the seminar, please introduce yourself if you'd like to in the comments, and register any questions through the YouTube chat, and those will be passed on to us, and hopefully we'll have time at the end for Gisa to respond to them. So Gisa is an economic anthropologist with an interest in how the future figures in human practice. Her research pioneers an ethnographic analysis of future making as a political, material, and affective endeavour central to contemporary capitalism. She has carried out a number of significant research projects working both independently and interdisciplinary teams. And as an experienced field researcher, she uses a qualitative and mixed methods toolkit, including, as we'll see today, ethnography, interviewing, life history analysis, extended case studies, institutional histories, and archival research. She's had many different fantastic positions, and I recommend people Google her to find out what those are, but kind of briefly focused on Europe and West Africa. Her research has explored how future imaginations and associated ethical orientations towards likely and unlikely things to come play out in techno-governmental practices and the cultural and material words shaped by them. Her first book, Alexanderplatz, Transforming Place in a Unified Germany, came out in 2010 and examines the rapid remake of Berlin through the lens of city planning, following the fall of state socialism. And the working title of her upcoming book is A Doubtful Hope, Oil, Wealth, and Time in Atlantic Africa. So just to give everybody a reminder, Gisa will be speaking for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some discussant comments from me and some time for question and answers from people joining online. So welcome, Gisa, and yeah, we look forward to your presentation on propositional politics of energy transition.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Karina, as well, for inviting me to give this talk today. It's a really great opportunity also to reach a different part of the world from the one that I'm normally inserted in. I just want to acknowledge as well, you'll see on the first slide in a moment that the paper I'm presenting comes out of work that I carried out with a postdoctoral researcher at the time. Now he's a lecturer as well, William Otre Darko. And I'll say a little bit more about this, the project that we were working on in a moment. I'll start sharing slides now. So where are they? Here, desktop one, share. Can you see them all right? Yeah?
Yes,
okay.
Yep, they're coming through great.
Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so this is William's name. You see it here on the slide. And I also changed the title of the paper ever so slightly. It's now Uncommoning the Energy Transition, but it'll still be about propositional politics. So let me move forward. Right. So on 29th of July 2022, climate activists set up camp in St. Felix Park in the Scottish city of Aberdeen, which is Europe's long-standing oil and gas capital. Blue, khaki, yellow, orange, red, and purple tents dotted the sprawling green space on the city's southern edge, which is wedged between the working-class neighbourhood of Torry, Aberdeen's brand new South Harbour expansion, an abandoned landfill site, and the East Tullos and Alton's industrial estates. Just behind the trees, the recently opened metal-cladded waste-to-energy plant glistened in the sun. A few white marquees equipped with wooden chairs invited people to linger and join into the conversation, though many simply sat on the grass outside enjoying the dry weather. This was Climate Camp Scotland, a multi-day event of non-violent action, complete with workshops, seminars, and a march down to the petro installations around Aberdeen Harbour. People were here to hold oil and gas companies to account for the harmful pollution they cause, to protest inadequate global climate policy, and to discuss possibilities for a just transition with unionists, workers, and communists. Activists from the more radical urban centres of Scotland, including Dundee and Glasgow, mingled with oil workers, and both came away with different perspectives on what the other might be like. One campaigner commented on the warm and enthusiastic welcome they had received from locals. It signalled a shift, she thought, in a city that had traditionally shown wholehearted support for the hydrocarbon industry. Climate Camp Scotland had come to St. Fiddick's Park not only because of hydrocarbons, however, but because of the slated development of an energy transition zone in the area. Aberdeen City Council has proposed a section of St. Fiddick's Park as an expendable opportunity site critical to the zone and specifically the South Harbour expansion. In Aberdeen, the debate on how best to sunset the hydrocarbon industry, which has dominated the Scottish economy for the past 50 years, runs high. Whether the city will maintain its status as regional industry centre in a post-carbon world is far from certain. For city leaders, business people, and Imagineers, energy transition has become both a prerequisite to limit the climate emergency and a catalyst for a wealth of industrial activity that can secure Aberdeen's economic future. And yet projects such as the Energy Transition Zone have engendered much criticism. Climate Camp Scotland was expressing solidarity with local campaigners who have tirelessly opposed the project. Our camp forms part of a long-running community effort to defend this valuable green space, the Climate Camp website announced. And in the face of this threat, we will use our camp to envision people-powered democratic solutions to the climate crisis. Okay. So this paper then explores how those caught up in efforts to bring energy transition to specific locations have begun to challenge the temporal and political limiting of their participation in the process. We build on Valentine and Hassoun when we refer to this as an uncommoning of energy transition. It entails a querying of assumptions of commonality, of temporal continuity and inevitability that underpin both dominant contemporary projects and scholarly accounts of energy futurity. We ask instead from where, by whom, and by what means transition futures are built. As a process that is considered both imminent and life-saving, the 21st energy transition assumes a common point of departure, a shared hope and directionality. It aims to halt or even revert global temperature rises that are caused by the burning of fossil fuels and now threaten to render the planet's ecological, financial, and social systems dysfunctional. Failure to achieve transition is widely seen to spell collapse. This has translated into a set of interconnected temporal and socio-political orders, from the 2015 Paris Agreement to national policy frameworks that pledge to reach net zero by determinate dates, so 2045 for Scotland, for example, and 2050 for the UK. They are supported by a technopolitical embrace of renewable sources of energy, including wind and hydrogen, then also electrification and decarbonization measures such as carbon sequestration, with the aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This has resulted in a range of energy transition experiments, such as the construction of new energy infrastructure, and so green industrial sites, and a rearrangement of regional and local geographies. Energy transition is often celebrated as a moment of potentiality and experimentation that reaches beyond the technomaterial into the vestiges of subject-object relations more than human relationalities, political and social life. However, what we want to point out here is that it also destabilizes extractive locales and has posed new political problems encapsulated in local policy making and contestations around how the transition can be made just. The concept of just transition points to specific politics of transition, drawing out the entwined, conflicting spatiotemporal, technical, social, as well as ethical dimensions that are present in this process. Just briefly, to sum up Scottish national policy on this, the focus there has been on labour issues, so the fate of fossil fuel workers and communities, and on not replicating historical experiences of abrupt and haphazard industrial decline. The statement by SNP's, the Scottish National Party's leader, Humza Yousaf, at the 2023 party conference, where he said, "We will not do to any worker in the northeast what Thatcher did to the mining communities right across Scotland," sums up this sentiment. This includes nods to equity and social inclusivity. A Just Transition Commission created in 2018 is tasked with providing and expertise and advising Scottish Government on the matter. There's a Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Net Zero and Just Transition, and in early 2023, the Scottish Government ran a consultation on a new draft energy strategy and just transition plan. Since 2021, a £500 million Just Transition Fund has been committed over a 10-year period to support projects facilitating the region's transition to net zero. Over 50 million of this was awarded in the first year. Both the ETZ, the Energy Transition Zone project that I'm referring to, and some of the community projects that have voiced opposition to the plans have benefited from this funding. There's a risk, or indeed an intention, that such supposedly just energy experiments become very narrowly defined, directed towards unambiguous future goals, net zero, climate neutrality, and so on, and overlooking the considerable social as well as material upheaval they may cause. Business cases, Gantt charts, municipal development plans, and other commercial and political artifacts become gestures of potentiality that are both literal and figurative means to occupy space. This paper then expands on a growing body of social science literature that examines how energy transition lands in place. Specifically, it seeks to understand how experiments such as the Aberdeen Energy Transition Zone help construct a common shared imaginary of energy transition, and once realized are invoked as a measure of its success. The ETZ claims to turn expert forecasts in innovative low-carbon technologies into, and I quote from their website, new energy, new opportunity, and a region renewed, backed by major Scottish and UK government funding. And surprisingly, this prominent transition project has fast become a focus of simmering discontent around current Scottish energy politics. Experiments gesturing at climate redemption and business opportunity in the offing stand in tension with place-based practices and claims whose temporal orientation comes to be classed as one of oppositional difference. As my opening vignette illustrates, the local campaign to protect St. Fittick's Park from the ETZ readily articulated with the hopes of a growing number of people. Indeed, we were also by far not the only academic researchers who took the campaign as a vehicle for projecting their own scholarly hope. Many of those critical of the ETZ developments frame their actions as a way of reclaiming the just transition concept from the powers that be. Future imaginaries of just transition, as well as green recovery, they argue, are invoked to bolster political decisions around energy transition developments in Aberdeen that actually risk reinforcing socioeconomic inequities instead of mitigating them. We draw on Dani et al.'s distinction between experiment and proposition to understand how such difference is not just a matter of residual conflict. Dani et al., they cite Latour to explain that while the experiment anticipates its possible results through prior postulations and the constitution of the scientific apparatus, propositions, by contrast, emerge from uncertain, tentative, and more than human articulations. The aim of propositions, or what Dani et al. Call a propositional politics, is to ensure that the energy transition does not simply result in more of the same. We mobilize this analytical distinction between experiment and proposition in the paper to understand how propositions articulated by residents, activists, allies, and others around St. Fittick's Park, Lentory, which is the neighborhood that is adjacent to St. Fittig's Park, have been drawn into the force field of an experiment named the energy transition. We ask not what energy transition is, will be, or could be, but how this imaginary is mobilized and contested. Our discussion is informed by the results of a larger project that, commencing in 2019, explored processes of dis- and reassembly in the UK oil and gas sector against the backdrop of changing industrial policy and as well as diminishing production in the North Sea. The broader research too would take us to Scotland, to Aberdeen, and allowed us to appreciate what we witnessed in Aberdeen in this larger context and of discussion around the region's future. In Aberdeen, we carried out intermittent fieldwork between August 21 and September 2023, mostly at events and public consultations, community assemblies and protests, but one of us, William, also attended the monthly online meetings of Friends of St. Fittig's Park, who were an important party in problematizing the ETZ, and for us became an important research partner. It's a group that was formed in 2020 and comprises a core of around 10 people drawn from all sorts of walks of life in Aberdeen. We also carried out a bunch of interviews with people in Aberdeen, again, a broad range of people, campaigners, representatives of the Aberdeen City Council, of the business community, public bodies and other agencies that are promoting economic development there, as well as local artists, commentators. And we also did some archival research to get a sense of the historical dimensions of this project. Okay, so in Aberdeen, the energy transition heralds both opportunity and crisis. The challenge, as one of our interlocutors put it, is to try and manage it as a transition rather than just hoping that it might happen. Put differently, the challenge is less whether the energy transition will happen than where it will happen and who will benefit from it. Most everyone now agrees that there's a need for change for the planet to stay within the limits of livable climate change. COP26, held in nearby Glasgow in 2021, stressed the urgency of action and seemed to persuade even the most steadfast hydrocarbon champions that decarbonisation and renewables, now absorbed into a rebranded basket of offshore energies, are a must. Posters at Offshore Europe 2023, the celebrated week-long energy industry fair that dominates Aberdeen every 2 years, help craft the shared narrative of a city leading the global energy transition. And in an impassioned summoning of this development, the website of the ETZ project declares, "This is the time and Aberdeen is the place." This is a recent shift, however. Only a few years ago, at a summit held in 2015, the Aberdeen billionaire and philanthropist Sir Ian Wood presaged that Aberdeen was sleepwalking into the future. Initial stages to remedy this dire situation squarely focused on strengthening hydrocarbon extraction in the North Sea. The 2016 Aberdeen City Region deal, for example, included no mention of energy transition, but proposed the construction of a new oil and gas technology centre, which by 2021 had been renamed Net Zero Technology Centre. Arguably, in the Scottish North East, talk about transition, with its emphasis on continuity and evolution, has allowed the oil and gas industry to assert a central role in the phase-out of fossil fuels, buttressed by government industry agreements such as the 2021 North Sea Transition Deal. Energy transition was an afterthought in the Aberdeen Harbour expansion too, which now claims St. Fittig's Park as an important hinterland to fuel renewables ambitions by connecting the harbour with the ETZ. From today's vantage, as some of our interlocutors noted, the delay to include renewables and energy transition technology into Aberdeen's urban development strategy is astounding. At a time of intensified interurban competition, implemented by the UK and Scottish governments through city region deals and green free port bids, it may even have harmed the local economy. Energy transition must now happen at pace, as city promoters say, to ensure Aberdeen's regional and international competitiveness. Decisiveness is required to compensate for earlier tardiness. Despite the 11 EU-funded wind turbines, which you can see in this picture on the slide, which raised their heads just off Aberdeen's coast, and also a significant hydropowered bus fleet, Europe's largest apparently, the city has remained Europe's unmistakable petroleum capital. Corporate influence is imprinted all over the city, from corporate logos to services for the industry to art gallery sponsorship. A recent planning document, the Aberdeen Local Development Plan 2023, invokes the city's long history of reinvention and its ability to, I quote, embrace economic opportunity when it arose as a basis from which to approach the challenge of energy transition. Indeed, with the discovery of North Sea oil in 1969, Aberdeen metamorphosed almost overnight from a city focused on fishing, agriculture, and other smaller industries into an onshore base for the emergent offshore industry. American oil and gas companies rushed in and brought well-paid jobs, a real estate boom, and relative prosperity, while the rest of the country suffered economic crisis. As the historian Terry Brotherstone writes, I quote, "There was a Klondike atmosphere of hit and miss enterprise as Aberdeen's conservative gentility and well-concealed poverty faced boomtown frenzy and divisive social upheaval," unquote. Oil was seen as, and I quote again, an antidote to Scottish deindustrialization, as the historian Ian Gibbs writes. It was seen as a means to ward off British centralism and to rectify historical experiences of internal colonization. "It's Scotland's oil" was the slogan with which the Scottish National Party achieved political breakthrough in the two 1974 general elections. Instead of fulfilling such utopian dreams, however, oil and gas only enabled a significant shift in balance between capital and labour that has since characterised the UK's carbon neoliberalism. Significantly, that history of gung-ho change invoked by today's city makers was not experienced as such by all. In conversation with us and in a short film documenting their campaign, Friends of St. Felix Park identified rather different historical continuities. An illustration of this is Shell's establishment in the early 1970s of an oil and gas supply base at Aberdeen Harbour's Maitland's Quay, where previously there had stood the fish processing factories of Old Tory. The decision by Aberdeen City Council to permit Shell's constructions was widely read as signalling the industry's intentions to make Aberdeen its home, with all the economic benefits this might have. But it also overturned a no development guarantee that had been given to residents of Old Tory just a few years earlier. As Shell operations moved they not only knocked the characteristic smell of fish out of the area, they also upended Tory people's livelihoods. Oil divided an already unequal city. Aberdeen's real estate market rapidly became tied to the price of oil. Prior to 2014, the oil price slump, property prices were among the top 10 highest in the UK. Short-term lets and Airbnb for oil workers have crowded out affordable housing, and therefore also nurses and doctors and teachers who are unable to pay local rents. Some of the Tory neighbourhoods, so again, this area adjacent to St. Felix Park, are among the nation's most disadvantaged. As Adrian Crofton, a physician from the Tory medical practice, has been keen to point out. Especially the area south of Balnagasc Road, with its aging tower blocks overlooking St. Felix Park, figures in the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation map in deep red as one of the most deprived. Reducing access to green space with the ETZ development, as Crofton and other Aberdonian medical practitioners warn, will only exacerbate health inequalities and further reduce life expectancy of people living in the area. The notion put forth by the Local Development Plan 2023 that Aberdeen can build on a history of entrepreneurial change eclipses such views and the long-standing experiences of urban corrosion and suffering engendered by the North Sea oil experiment. So in some then, transition has in some sense portended progress, and with the gradual decline of existing infrastructures and implementation of new climate positive projects, it has also destabilized and it's thought to restabilize the fossil-based socioeconomic arrangements that dominate Aberdeen. As the frontiers of so-called energy, green energy push onwards to create value from climate emergency, they can feed off and perpetuate established modes of dispossession and marginalization. And we are, of course, not the first ones to show that. So Boyer and Howe, Sovakol and others have demonstrated that too. In Aberdeen, as elsewhere, pundits invoke the urgency of crisis to act as justification and driver of policies and experiments. Some now worry that renewable energy developments will only continue centuries of exploitation of Scottish resources, however, which started with the Highland clearances of the early 19th century and peaked with the North Sea hydrocarbon extractive project. In this view, energy transition can be both creative and destructive, quoting Curley here, furthering accumulation at the center while transferring the burden of development to the periphery. So I jump now to a more ethnographic part again. Our tour of what is to become the ETZ started at Greyhope Bay Cafe, which sits atop a rocky peninsula next to the historical Torry Battery and offers stunning views across Aberdeen Harbour and the bay. One can spot dolphins, the coming and goings of supply vessels and a ferry to Shetland, and in the distance, the gentle rotating wind turbines. On the drive up, Nigel, who is one of the directors of ETZ Limited, which is the body that runs the ETZ project, and who's closely involved in the development of this project, he excitedly pointed out the granite townhouses that line Victoria Road, built from wealth generated by the harbour. The townhouses, Nigel explained, manifest Tory's grounding in the city's industrial life. Now, as we sat sipping our flat whites, Nigel lamented that this fact, this grounding of Tory and the city's life in the harbour, this fact was almost completely forgotten. He was baffled, he claimed, that instead of appreciating this historical connection between Tory and the harbour, people would think about developments like the ETZ as an outsider's project. It's not for us, it's for them. While part of our conversation and morning focused on the supposed advantages the ETZ will bring for Aberdeen, the region, and the Tory community, much of it was about why this specific location has been selected as project site. The stretch of St. Wittig's Park to be included in the ETZ, as Nigel explained, constitutes important hinterland for the harbour. It was required for the ambitious renewable energy developments that ETZ seeks to attract, including recently approved wind and hydrogen ventures off the Aberdeen coast. Tying past, present, and future from fisheries and oil to prospective transition technologies into a seamless temporal trajectory, the choice appeared a natural one. The idea for an Aberdeen energy transition zone is usually attributed to Sir Ian Wood, the billionaire businessman and philanthropist that I mentioned earlier. It quickly became a placeholder that, as one interlocutor argued, would future-proof the city. It promises to transform 40 hectares of brownfield and greenfield site into 12,500 jobs, £400 million in added value, and a contribution to the so-called Scottish cluster, one of 6 national energy hubs, competing for funding as part of the UK's devolved renewable sector. At a business breakfast in 2021, a gathering of tentative ideas and often uncontested expertise, the ETZ project was described as shovel-ready by Wood, although the St. Wittig's Park area had not yet been rezoned for the development. announced as funding streams in national budget readings and in public speeches, the zone and the institutional configuration that supports it were conjured into existence. A month prior to becoming a registered charity, ETZ Ltd guaranteed 27 million committed UK government funding for the zone, with a further 26 million Scottish government matching funding in 2021. The project has also received £14 million from the Scottish Just Transition Fund. One of the representatives of the ETZ Ltd, which is a colleague of Nigel, who I introduced earlier, he called it the real Michael Porter thing on acid, invoking the Harvard economist Michael Porter's idea that clustering enhances business competitiveness, productivity, and innovation. The result, we argue, is a mode of temporal enclosure embodied in the plans for the ETZ. We take this term from Jaramillo and Carmona, who seek to move beyond common understandings of enclosure as a historically situated type of physically and legally barring others from accessing and using previously common land. Temporal enclosure invites us to consider a more varied set of spatiotemporal practices and processes that exclude alternative visions. So a kind of commoning, in other words, to use Valentine and Hassan's term. This builds on a variety of gestures, that is, industry-specific, technical, legal, commercial practices and devices that signal absent potential and promise future gain. Or again, in the words of Jaramillo and Carmona, the creation of apparently, I quote them, the creation of apparently inevitable futures and the illusion of progress are not byproducts of enclosures, but a means by which these become a social reality. And so in a longer version of this paper, we then explain how the temporal enclosure that is Aberdeen's ETZ has consisted of a number of different elements. That is the kind of narratives that I just described, that emphasize both the ETZ's significance for successful energy transition, but also embedded in a longer kind of historical temporal narrative that ties the past to the present into the future. There's been the earmarking of public funds, the setting aside of actual pieces of land for temporary purposes, for the harbour expansion, for example, that are threatening to become more permanent. There's also been an assembling of community representatives, or in kind of effort to assemble the public in order to sanction the plans for the ETZ. That tries to invoke and involve people in the envisioning of the future, but that also, we argue, depoliticizes. So the issue of community here is particularly central, and the ETZ being able to claim that the community has been involved, has been dealt with, as it were. And last, there's also the adoption of a kind of expert position by the ETZ Ltd and the master planners that it has hired in pronouncing themselves on what would be best for the location. Importantly, the ETZ experiment is situated in layered histories of extraction and injury, the well-known ghosts of capitalism resulting from wealth inequality and industrial damage. I met Robert on a windy but dry day in May 22 at the old golf course for what he called a memory walk around St. Wittig's Park. There are manifold ways in which the area has been dumped upon, he tells me. First, Tory and St. Wittig's have carried in no small part the burden of Aberdeen's oil boom development. There are also the landfill site, now overgrown. There's the sewage treatment plant, which gives off a distinctive smell, and most recently the waste to energy plant that was bitterly opposed by residents but is now up and running. The park is framed by community gardens, play areas, and a skating rink that share space with the ruins of a medieval church and a graveyard where some of Robert's ancestors are buried. The area south of Torry is a sacrifice zone, only weakly balanced by the preservation of St. Wittig's Park as an ecological sanctuary. for both humans and non-humans, including hundreds of bird species, deer, and other wildlife. Ducks swim on the water. A university student is taking samples to count these less invisible inhabitants of the burn. Wooded areas sit next to grassland and patches of wetlands canalized to filter effluents from the nearby industrial estate en route to the sea, itself an award-winning initiative by environmental agencies and Aberdeen City Council. These are repeated efforts at more than human relation building that have made St. Fittick's a buffer between the residents of Tory and the surrounding industrial activities. Friends of St. Fittick's Park, arts practitioners and their allies have highlighted how the ETZ will damage the area's ecology and break down this buffer zone. They write Facebook posts, organize events, use smartphone videos, songs and greeting cards, pick litter, and cultivate vegetables in the community garden. They elicit stories and photos from residents and sympathizers. Their activities are about care and renewal and life and are inflected by personal biographies and experiences of environmental injustice. In this context of the campaign against the ETZ, they amount to what we term a propositional politics, to quote Daniel, which is an emergent form of thinking and doing politics that is embedded within specific material arrangements. So here, residents and campaigners query the effort at spatial, legal, and temporal enclosure embodied in the ETZ as an experimental testbed for novel techno-material and commercial opportunities. There have also been propositions for community ownership of the park, for example, as a in order to wrestle control away from Aberdeen Council, which is the current landowner. Ideas for financing included micro-energy projects, community education centers, a zero-carbon building, a community cafe, and also other kind of revenue-generating projects. However, this project itself is currently on hold. As one of our interlocutors explained, we just don't have the capacity for it or the hunger for it. Improvisational practices of care are significantly tempered by limited resources, including people's own non-remunerated time and capacities. Safe St. Fittick's Park equals just transition, read one of the placards and banners held up by members of Friends of St. Fittick's Park, Friends of the Earth Scotland, Climate Camp Scotland, and other activist allies who had gathered in front of the Scottish Parliament building on a grey, wet and cold mid-January day in 2023. The 40-odd protesters had taken the fight from Aberdeen to parliamentarians in Edinburgh, with speeches, drumming and chants of whose park, whose land, our land, and hands off Tory. The activists aimed to pressurize parliamentarians against approving the draft Aberdeen Local Development Plan, which includes the planned rezoning of St. Fittick's Park from greenbelt to industrial use. 4 months later, these placards and banners were again displayed at the Aberdeen Harbour to grace the first visit of the new First Minister Hamza Yusuf, and again in September 23 at the Aberdeen City Council at the occasion of a vote on whether St. Fittick's Park land next to the harbour should indeed be made available for lease under the new ETZ scheme. The protesters call that preserving St. Fittick's Park would be an act of just transition directly challenges official invocations of the concept as enshrined in the Just Transition Fund from which the ETZ is co-sponsored. The challenge is linked to a broader critique of what ETZ protesters refer to as webs of entwined political and corporate influence that became entrenched during the city's oil and gas heydays and seem to persist in the efforts to bring energy transition to Aberdeen. Calls for community empowerment counter a historical sense of dispossession and sellout, which turns public infrastructure and public goods into commercialized disposable assets. From this perspective, just transition has been co-opted by projects such as the ETZ and is conflated with narrow industrial economic imperatives that underpin Aberdeen's urban development policy, economic and knowledge networks. Over the past 2 years, the discussion around the ETZ has partly become drawn into a broader regional coalition of activism and debate, such as the Scottish Climate Camp in 2022 that I mentioned at the start of the paper. Friends of St Fiddick Park collaborate with researchers in North East Scotland, with Labour union representatives, as well as through long-standing cooperation with the Just Transition Manager at Friends of the Earth Scotland, in organising workshops, printing leaflets, and contributing to the group. In 2021 and again in May 2023, members of Friends of St Fiddick Park held a Tories People's Assembly, each attended by about 30 to 40 people, out of which they created a new pathway for action with the slogan of "This land is our land and no one else's. This land belongs to those who care for it." The declaration of Tory that resulted from the last People's Assembly constitutes an uncommoning of energy transition by questioning narrow economic imperatives and experimental forms of energo power. Against the ETZ as a testbed for novel technomaterial and commercial opportunities, the activist responses query this effort at temporal enclosure with a propositional politics that exceeds its bounds. They emphasize a vision of self-determination and care, where nature and community are valued more than corporate profit. So in conclusion then, this is probably not the end of the discussion around St Fiddick Park. In fact, it's ongoing, even though this area has now been rezoned and the plans for the ETZ can in principle go ahead. Both activists and their allies, however, but also ETZ Limited, they emphasize the developments are not predetermined, that they are not foregone conclusions. ETZ Limited does so both for legal and commercial reasons, but also no doubt to stifle further criticism of their activities. The activists and campaigners, by contrast, they seek to maintain hope. They seek to keep people mobilized now by saying there's still hope, to explore other avenues and other ways of intervening wherever possible during the long drawn-out phase that will now follow of actually leasing and planning and constructing developments in that zone. There's indeed a chance, I would suggest, that the ETZ project may not come to pass, at least not in the way that it is currently envisaged, perhaps just in a more limited form. The energy transition might not arrive in Aberdeen in the way that would satisfy the business interests that are currently invested in it. There's a possibility that this may save St Fiddick Park from being bulldozed or partially bulldozed. But rather than considering this as a pure win for activists, however, it's likely that this will itself leave the park and the area's human and non-human residents hanging in some ways. It will produce a situation where perhaps community-driven developments may be obstructed because of the existence of a master plan, because of the rezoning of this area that has already taken place. The question is then, who would rehabilitate this space if projects were stopped or fall through? So there's a kind of open-endedness to the implementation of the ETZ that will be interesting to observe, and that makes also the kind of intentions and the hopes that are associated with our project rather open-ended. So the research itself has a kind of propositionality to it, the kind of analytical framework that we offered here, both in terms of the conclusions, but also methodologically. So we are extending now our research by working with a local artist and a curator in using sound walks, for instance, around St Fiddick Park to open up different perspectives on what this area is about now, how it is changing, and what it will become in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gisa, for that fascinating seminar. remind people, if you have questions for Gisa, we have about 15 minutes left in the seminar. I'm going to have some comments now, but please do send them through. They'll come to us, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them, which is my signal to be reasonably brief in my comments. I had the good fortune to be able to read a version of this paper beforehand, and so I've got a few thoughts and I guess questions in response. I think this paper is details so clearly that the transition to renewable energy puts all kinds of actors in motion. The ostensible kind of promise of this transition for justice, for capital, for livelihoods, for finance, looks and feels different, and I think that's something that we easily forget. The transition, whatever it is, this underdetermined transition, fundamentally what it is, it signals transformation simply in its name, and it's molten with this potential that different parties seek to mold and contain, meanwhile trying to contain others, interpretations. The transition is an infrastructural one, but it's also necessarily social and therefore contested, as we've seen here in Australia recently, with our own promise to meet net zero has led to proposals with rich in kind of development plan documents for offshore wind development that is now seeing kind of strange bedfellows and curious companions with pro-nuclear conservative politicians pledging to save the whales in the name of other kinds of promise. And I think what you signal about this transition, Gisa, is that this promise kind of comes in the form that it's democratized, but also contained, and different agents kind of seek to foreclose it to some extent. The Aberdeen Energy Transition Zone will be a cluster, we learn, a kind of wellspring of employment and added value, but a cluster of what, and a cluster doing what, employment doing what, and for who. It brings to mind conversations I've had here in Australia with professionals involved in developing zero carbon hubs in Northern Australia, where government project proposals kind of boast these high numbers of employment, allegedly addressing local disadvantage, but that the actual developers know will require significant effort to recruit and import skilled workers from overseas. So how do these promises kind of circulate at different levels, at different scales, and perhaps how do they land? And your paper draws attention to that. It also draws attention to how futures are made in the present through promises, portfolios, websites, conference addresses, presentations. And these interpretations can themselves be very powerful, kind of pre-populating that future, occupying it, crowding out other visions, these assured plans, pronouncing things as shovel-ready long before one could actually strike a shovel physically into them. And I guess I draw attention for interested people to your work, which has been very influential on me, on resource affects. And I think drawing attention, as you have in this paper, it's very important to think about how the kinds of affects that cluster and kind of determine these energies. Discontent, as you talked about in this paper, discontent, pride, angst, hope. And it brought to mind, for me, the sociologist John Urry's paper in 2014, talking about kind of the problem of energy for social theory. And Urry saying, that social theory kind of hadn't paid enough attention to energy's role in shaping politics. And it made me think, if what have we've been through is carbon democracy, in Timothy Mitchell's terms, analysis like yours points towards what we might start to think of as renewable democracy, that it's which is politically participatory, community co-designed, co-funded by governments. I thought there was a curious irony, as you say, as you point out, that governments both the funding programs for the transition become objects, become resources actually for rival parties. So we've got this very participatory feel, but nonetheless a democracy that functions kind of following established dynamics of infrastructural and resource extraction dominated by large multinationals. And so I wondered, for you, as a kind of question, is this a useful line of inquiry? Is the energy transition altering our political norms, or is it a product of them? Are we still carbon democracies? And I guess my own intuitive answer to that is in the curious detail in your paper about how the Oil and Gas Technology Center was very easily renamed the Net Zero Technology Center. You know, are we just peeling the sign off an old democratic formation and putting it on, putting on a new sign, but it's the same formation underneath? And one answer from your paper seems to lie in this propositional politics, as you say, from Andre Darnier and colleagues from the very excellent book, Energy Worlds in Experiment, which I recommend to people. It's an open access book, where propositional, politics is figured as a kind of form of dialogue, working through speculative registers on as yet unknown kind of capacities. It's this, following the STS scholar Bruno Latour, rather than thinking of experiment, thinking of the kind of occasions of an interpretive offer for, things that may surprise us. And, Latour is very interested in how non-humans play into that story, and you signaled that in your paper, but I wondered if you could say a bit more about who these non-humans are, and what kind of presence and futures they might want. In relation to, secondly, in relation to propositional politics, this proposition, it seems, is not simply forward-looking in Aberdeen. As your paper shows, there's lots of history at work here. Oil has played a crucial role in Scottish politics, for differentiating Scotland from England, asserting its own sovereignty, and the current government defines its kind of transition in part as pro-worker in reference to the anti-worker politics of the Thatcher administration. And it brought to mind a paper by Argenti and Knight in 2015 about how solar development in Greece, for example, was received by many locals, not in terms of climate change adaptation or carbon neutrality, but in terms of histories of domination by Western European powers. And it brought to mind, for me, questions about energy justice, often latent within them is an idea of who deserves justice and to what level. What you enter into the transition is imagined as the thing that you deserve to keep. Thus, for example, here in Australia, kind of private landholders are often framed as deserving the value of their land at the time of the transition, even if that value is partly based on the prior dispossession of other peoples, such as First Peoples. And so the slogan you quote at the end, "Our land and no one else's," kind of brought to mind, it made me want to know more about the kind of forms of temporal enclosure, the kind of enclosures of the past, perhaps, that activists' openness to the future kind of requires. So those are my kind of mix of thoughts on this. As I said, fascinating paper, and feel free to respond to any of them or none of them while we pull some questions, perhaps.
So let me see what I respond to. Regarding maybe your last question about land, so this is public land. So there's a stretch. So St. Felix Park is a public park. There's a particular stretch of land that the campaigners are concerned about, which is part of this park. It's public land. So when they say our land, it is a notion of publicness, of common land, so not necessarily personal land, or not at all personal. In fact, I don't know to what extent, and we didn't review that, to what extent people who are part of the group are landowners in the sense of owning their house and their plot of land. So it's perhaps slightly different there from the Australian situation. But they're interesting questions, which I can't go into detail about, regarding the decision to locate the ETZ here next to Aberdeen Harbour, because there's public land that can be used quite readily, rather than privately owned land, which might have been the hinterland at other port sites or potential port sites along the coast, where there would have been much more negotiation with private landowners about, are you going to give up your land in order for us to develop this ETZ? So something to look into a little bit more. It was something that came up in a conversation that I had with one of the ETZ directors, and that might be worth pursuing further. Regarding I was intrigued by what you said about, are we moving from a carbon democracy to renewables democracy? And is there a kind of qualitative change that we can observe? And like you, and probably many critical anthropologists and other social scientists who've written about and observed the energy transition developments, I would probably hesitate. But I think it pushes us, your question or your comment here really pushes us to think about what do we mean by propositional politics and what it can actually achieve. Because at the moment, this kind of propositionality, I would say, is happening within a kind of confined circle of people talking to each other, but it isn't, even though it is, as you say, it is, supported by funding streams that come kind of from a broader kind of Scottish government effort to nourish a just transition, as is the ETZ. But it doesn't therefore become part of democratic policies as they stand. So the whole planning process in itself, follows a very prescribed route of this is where consultation can happen. This is where the citizens or the residents can be brought in and comment on it. And actually, what's interesting about Friends of St. Fittick's Park, they have, from a certain point onwards, actively resisted that. So they've actually been kind of protesting outside, where consultations were happening outside those spaces, asking people not to go in because they didn't want to be co-opted in that process of where the ETZ Limited could then say, well, we've consulted the community or we've heard them all. So there's a kind of resistance happening that rejects kind of the formalized processes, more formalized democratic processes of inclusion, in order to develop something new, but partly also because the key argument here is, I mentioned the term, that there are these webs of influence that dominate politics, city politics in Aberdeen, and that those are the interests that are vested interests that one actually cannot get around, and that these vested interests dominate all these kind of potential fora where resident citizens may be able to get to become involved, but they already know that the conclusions are foregone conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'll leave it them in case there are other questions.
Well, we have time. We're running out of time, but we have time for one question.
Okay.
And I'm going to take the chair's privilege and choose one. And the question that we have is from my colleague Sophie Adams here at Deakin University. And Sophie's question is: does the critique of the ETZ by the Friends of St. Fittick's Park extend to all renewable energy projects? Do they articulate alternate visions for the renewable energy transition, climate change response more broadly? I definitely had a very similar kind of question. Is there an alternate future on offer?
Not by the group itself, no. And they also always define themselves in a bind in that they have to, or they do stress always that they are not against energy transition. They are just against this energy transition project, or how the energy transition is being articulated in this particular area. So I think they would, can't speak for them, but my impression is they wouldn't go that far to say, no, we are rejecting that. What is happening within that is more a kind of subtle, and this is also beginning now. So for instance, next week, unfortunately I can't participate, there's going to be a community meeting where a key point will be discussion of retrofitting of housing, for instance. So the question is, do we need these large-scale industrial developments, or can we do something that is more step-by-step, that also looks at individual consumption, reducing energy demand, rather than kind of going for the big techno-industrial solutions. So that's yes and no is the answer.
Yes and no is a good place to end. I was going to ask a question, which I think which is about how do we know when the future fails to arrive? But I think there's possibly no answer to that.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, the philosophical. We don't know.
Yes, but we are out of time, and I wanted to thank you again so much for this very fascinating presentation and I look forward, as I'm sure many others on the seminar, to the final version appearing somewhere before too long. So I'd like to thank everybody for tuning into this Science and Society Network seminar with Gisa Weszkalnys. I had my colleague Carrie Delgren try and help me with your name, Gisa. I'm sure I've really ruined it.
Right.
But anyway, thank you again for this presentation, and thank you everybody for tuning in.